Hey everyone, it's time to talk about what else I saw in April that I didn't already discuss here. Basically, it's everything I saw minus The Towering Inferno, which is the only movie I reviewed last month. Movie number 1 is a classic from 1948, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, directed by John Huston and starring Humphrey Bogart, Tim Holt, and Walter Huston. This was my first time seeing this film, a dark morality tale in the guise of a treasure hunt adventure where 3 unemployed Americans in Mexico, hungry for riches and success, pool their limited resources and go on a journey to find gold. They get more than they bargained for, though, as the camaraderie born of having a common goal is dismantled by greed, paranoia, and hatred. In addition to directing, John Huston also wrote the excellent script based on a novel, which features a few great monologues and some twisted development for Bogart's character. Bogart delivers one of his best performances, becoming almost devilish as he unravels. I want to make a couple more observations about this character, but they can be considered spoilers, so here's a warning for those of you who would prefer to skip this part. Alright, here we go. Humphrey Bogart having top billing really tricks the viewer into thinking he's the star, so he must be the hero. And maybe he is at the outset. Then he goes a little mad, and I think he turns into the villain. But one could make the argument that he was the villain all along. He steers honest, baby-faced Tim Holt down the path of eventual destruction. The way he pulls him along for a vengeful attack on the man who cheated them foreshadows that this is how things will go if you hitch your wagon to Bogart's. Now granted, Holt and Bogart are both desperate men, but Bogart from the beginning is more aggressive about trying to get what he wants, plus he has a mean streak. By contrast, without his interference, Holt might still be lying on that park bench. If I can go a little deeper, the more I thought about it, the more I saw parallels between Bogart's character, Fred C. Dobbs, and Shakespeare's Macbeth. Their stories follow a similar trajectory. You could go so far as to say that the old prospector's promises of gold in them thar hills is akin to the witch's prophecy, and that Curtain equals Banquo, the friend and comrade who poses a threat and must be disposed of, and whose ghost, or disappearing body, generates psychological disturbance. With both Dobbs and Macbeth, too, you can debate whether the character is a villain from the start or a tragic hero who makes a fateful choice to kill and must therefore die a horrible death himself. There's definitely food for thought there, and I don't know if anyone's ever made this parallel before, but it's been done now. Walter Huston, under his son's direction, also gives a wonderful performance as the old-timer who knows the ropes and might be setting the 2 men against each other, or might just be trying to warn them. Cleverly, the script tells the audience how things are going to go down in the first act, and it's one of those instances where little details in the beginning turn out to be relevant in the climax. Near the end, I had the sudden, startling thought that this movie's kind of like a very long Twilight Zone episode. Characters are tempted with an unusual path which they see as a shortcut to success. What they don't know is that shortcut is full of trouble, more trouble than the promised prize at the end of the journey is worth. They wind up in a virtually lawless, isolated area where there's nothing but conscience to deter them from killing each other. They're presented with a moral choice, do good or do evil, and then consequences follow, swift and just, with a heavy touch of irony. Things get dark, and then there's a rightness to the ending that makes it all quite fresh and satisfying. This isn't necessarily a movie I think I'm going to want to watch over and over again. It's a pretty negative story, and those don't tend to be my favorites, but it's one that certainly lives up to its reputation, and clearly, it's made me think. Movie number 2 is one from 2020 that showed up on Amazon Prime recently, Honest Thief. Liam Neeson stars as a bank robber who decides to go straight when he falls in love with a woman played by Kate Walsh. His plan to turn himself in, serve a little time, and start fresh with her, though, goes awry when the FBI agents investigating his claim decide to make themselves rich instead. Wow, back-to-back movies about greed. Awesome! You get pretty much what you expect with this one, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if, like my parents and me, you enjoy these PG-13 action thrillers that Liam Neeson stars in every couple of years. They're not particularly memorable or amazing. I honestly don't remember much about The Commuter, and even less about Nonstop, and I have to think a minute to remember what those movies are even called. It's not Liam Neeson on a train and Liam Neeson on a plane. But they provide a couple hours of diverting twists and turns, and a sympathetic protagonist you cheer on as he tries to outwit those who are conspiring against him. In addition to Neeson, who always delivers, Walsh's character is credible, and Jeffrey Donovan and Robert Patrick do well as tired-out agents, Donovan juggling his personal problems, which provide some comic relief. Jai Courtney plays the antagonist, and, let's say it didn't require much effort for me to believe his character was a detestable scumbag. I don't have anything against Jai Courtney personally, but he's just got one of those faces. Maybe he's the most wonderful, charming guy in real life. I don't know. I hope so. It's just, he was very... I want to back out of this. Anyway, I thought it was a fun movie. Not brilliant, but entertaining. The rest of the movies on this list I saw within 7 days of each other. Good thing April wasn't a week shorter, or this would be the end of the video. Movie number 3 is 1976's The Shootist, a film directed by Don Siegel that stars John Wayne and Lauren Bacall about an old gunslinger who finds out he hasn't long to live and takes a room in a widow's boarding house where he waits to die. The role is one of Wayne's best. It also turned out to be his last, made 3 years before he himself died of cancer, though contrary to myth, he did not have cancer at the time of filming. Included are many nods to past westerns, including an opening montage supposedly of the character's past, but really showing clips from old Wayne movies. The supporting cast features Jimmy Stewart, Ron Howard, Harry Morgan, Hugh O'Brian, Scatman Crothers, and John Carradine. Many of the actors in this movie appeared with Wayne in previous films, most notably Stewart and Carradine, who were both in 1962's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. I thought it an excellent idea to cast Carradine as the overeager Undertaker, and Harry Morgan's sheriff, gleeful about the main character's upcoming demise, is amusingly kooky. The weak links, I thought, were Ron Howard, who's okay but a little whiny, and Hugh O'Brian, who does what's required of him but doesn't make much of an impression. I'll also mention that this rendition of the West caught my attention. It's 1901, so things are a little more advanced and not quite so wild. Some interesting touches in this turn-of-the-century setting were the trolley car, the so-called horseless carriage, the dry process cleaning for suits, and Bacall's surprisingly modern-looking kitchen. But the main draw is the narrative and Wayne's performance. It's a good story with a bittersweet ending, emotional and frank without getting sentimental. It's one of those movies that's as much about what's not said as what is. It made me feel a bit down, but in a good way. It was sober without being depressing. Movie number 4 is a big one. So big that I've actually changed my mind about discussing it here. As I was working on this, I kept coming up with more observations to make, which would make this section longer, and when that happens, which it seldom does, it's a sign that I need to just make a solo review. Now, I didn't want to do this because I'm daunted by the prospect for a number of reasons, but I'll try and we'll see how it goes. Stay tuned for a video about Rashomon. Movie number 5 is 1953's Monsieur Hulot's Holiday, or, if you would like to hear me attempt to say the French title, Les Vacances de Monsieur Hulot, directed by and starring Jacques Tati. This is my first Jacques Tati film, and appropriately it's the one that introduces his popular comic character, the good-natured but bumbling Monsieur Hulot. This showed up on the Turner Classic Movies streaming app and pulled me in with its description. I wasn't sure what it would be like, but decided to give it a try, bringing my mom along for the ride, of course. I found out it's the kind of comedy that builds, the absurdities mounting until you can't help but be amused, and you eventually end up in the position where even the slightest silly thing sends you over the edge. At least that was my experience. I was exploding with laughter by the end. Monsieur Hulot is a bundle of quirkiness, with his silly walk, his noisy disaster of a car, his awkward fumbling, his charming out-of-placeness. He reminded me of a couple people I've known, actually, especially this one kid I went to school with who always walked on his toes. The character is likable in spite of his tendency to bungle things and create a predicament when everything was going smoothly, and that's important in this kind of comedy, I feel. You have to like the character who's causing all the trouble, or else it's just annoying. There isn't much of a plot here. It's a string of vignettes and incidents that occur in 1 week at a popular beach resort. I haven't the faintest idea if it's an accurate representation of seaside vacations in early 1950s France, or if the silent dinners and tight schedules are just an exaggeration. The effect was funny either way. I wondered if some of the comedy would be lost in translation, but it's mostly physical or visual with very little dialogue, which worked perfectly. I very much enjoyed it. Movie number 6 is 1951's Quo Vadis, the historical epic set during the reign of ancient Roman Emperor Nero and the rise of the early church. Robert Taylor stars as Marcus Vinicius, a Roman commander who falls for Deborah Carr's Lygia, a freed hostage of Rome whose Christian faith leads her to reject his advances. His desire to obtain her leads to a whole bunch of problems for everyone. I just reviewed 1959's Ben-Hur a few weeks ago, and this movie came up a couple times in the comments, as well it should. Both films were produced by Sam Zimbalist, based on late 19th century novels set during the ancient Roman Empire and featuring biblical themes and characters. They were both remakes of a silent film, both shot on location in Italy, both had musical scores composed by Miklos Rozsa, along with grandiose sets, sumptuous costumes, expensive effects, and legions of extras. Mervyn LeRoy directed Quo Vadis. It garnered 8 Oscar nominations, and it was one of the first and most commercially successful biblical epics of that period. I do think maybe it wasn't such a good idea to watch it for the first time so close to revisiting Ben-Hur, as I couldn't help making comparisons. I would have preferred to just watch it and let it stand on its own. I've been waiting to see it for 8 years. I could have waited a little longer, but it conveniently that's staying in, showed up on Turner Classic Movies streaming app, and that's rare, so I grabbed the opportunity. Was it the wrong move? I don't know. It is what it is. This is quite a long movie, shorter runtime than Ben-Hur, but I felt more aware of the length. While Taylor and Carr do fine and are convincing in their starring roles, maybe Taylor a little less so, being so American, the true standouts are Peter Ustinov and Leo Genn. Ustinov's tyrannical emperor is a narcissistic and campy loony bird, clearly delusional, but vaguely sane enough to get by. Leo Genn plays Petronius, the protagonist's kindly but cynical uncle, and a close advisor of Nero's who cleverly mocks him and plants ideas in his head, making him think they're his own, as a means of steering Nero away from his more destructive plans. I especially enjoyed the sly wit of the dialogue between these two, Ustinov having fun chewing the opulent scenery, while Genn is placid but alert. Other highlights include the famous burning of Rome and the martyrdom in the arena. Like in Ben-Hur, Jesus Christ appears a couple times, filmed from behind or from a distance. I didn't find this portrayal of Christ as powerful as the one in Ben-Hur. In both films, Finley Curry appears in a key role. In Ben-Hur, he's one of the 3 wise men. In Quo Vadis, he plays Peter. Both Peter and Paul figure into this story, not something I'd expected, and I learned afterward that the film's Latin title, which means Whither Goest Thou, and some of its narrative come from the Apocrypha. I'm definitely not interested in having a debate on that topic in the comments, so I'm gonna move away from that. I don't know, this just wasn't the story and movie I'd been anticipating all these years. I enjoyed it, the spectacle and color, the drama and the journey, but there was a lot that struck me as contrived or drawn out. There's historical and religious context, but accuracy is hit and miss. It was alright, I liked the movie, I'm glad I finally seen it, but I feel even more sure now than before that movies based on stories in the Bible, or in this case the Apocrypha, which I'm not familiar with really, just aren't something I gravitate toward, and I say that as a Christian. Movies number 7 and 8 I didn't exactly start out watching. I was in the room when my mom put the first one on YouTube on the TV, but I was working on something, so not giving it my full attention all the time. It's Countdown to Looking Glass, a Canadian docudrama from 1984 about events leading to a nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was a contemporary of higher-profile nuclear war movies like The Day After and Threads, both of which I've seen. Both of those incorporate news broadcasts as a narrative element to tell the story and to create a sense of realism. Countdown to Looking Glass does that as well, even more so, though not more than 1983's Special Bulletin, which I haven't seen but I've heard is presented 100% as a news broadcast. This movie does have some dramatic cutaways to allow for the development of certain characters, but for the most part, it's straightforward news broadcasts. Personally, I found it to be a little dull and dry, but like I said, I wasn't totally invested in it, until the last half hour, when the dangerous situation escalates and characters struggle to maintain their professionalism in the face of mounting fear. If you have a particular taste for this subgenre, as my mom and brother do, me to a lesser extent, you should probably check this out if you haven't seen it. That's number 7, which my mom watched at my brother's recommendation. Number 8 is one of the movies YouTube recommended after that. Because of course, if you watch one, they're going to think that you want to watch 50 more. And though it was pretty late by then, my mom clicked on it just to see what it was like, and we ended up watching the whole thing. Not an ideal situation. This is not the kind of movie that I want to watch in the middle of the night and then go to bed thinking about. Movie number 8 is 2014's Aftermath, and it takes the opposite approach. There's little setup and explanation of what caused World War III. It's all about the consequences for a group of 9 survivors, most of them strangers to each other, who end up hunkering down in a basement trying to live on meager rations, dealing with radiation sickness while crazy people run amok outside. This has a low score on IMDb, and I can come up with some reasons why. It's a low-budget film with some pretty bad CGI for the detonations. There are some artistic choices I don't think were a good idea, namely some corny, overdone freeze frames. There are a couple things that don't make sense, and it's a dreary, depressing film. But while I felt I couldn't wait for it to be over, I couldn't tear myself away either. The situation was awful, but I had to stick with it to the end. This is a bleak picture of what could be in the event of a nuclear holocaust. Not an original concept. One thing it reminded me of, besides Night of the Living Dead, was a little-known movie called 5, the earliest film about survivors of a nuclear holocaust that I'm aware of, and that came out as far back as 1951. Aftermath is far more grim and graphic, of course. It's not for kids, and not even for some grown-ups. But the characters, symbolic of the last vestiges of humanity, garnered up enough sympathy for me to hope they might somehow pull through, or at least find some moment of happiness before the inevitable end. The cast is headed by C.J. Thomason, Monica Keena, and Edward Furlong, who all put in a solid effort, giving the story and characters more depth than I first supposed they would have. It's a super downer of a film, though. Finally, movie number 9 is 1960's Tunes of Glory. It's a heavy post-war military drama in which Alec Guinness's popular major, who was made acting commanding officer of his beloved Highland Regiment during the war, finds himself replaced as CO by an unknown entity, an Oxford-educated upper-crust lieutenant colonel played by John Mills. The tension between these two officers, present before they even meet, escalates through the course of the film until the clash of wills and leadership styles results in tragedy. Supposedly, Guinness and Mills were first cast in the opposite roles, but agreed a switcheroo would be better, allowing them both to play against type. I was never sure what exactly I was supposed to think of Guinness's Major, a boisterous, lax-with-the-rules type who drinks heartily and wants the men to enjoy themselves, but is also prideful with a short fuse and questionable judgment. I often found myself in greater sympathy with Mills's underdog by default, but his character was just as difficult. I felt sorry for him, especially in his impossible position, but he had his own issues. The film's greatest strength, I think, is in how it gradually reveals that these two men have more in common than they know, including problems in their private lives and personal instability. I made a Macbeth reference earlier in this video, and now I'm going to do it again. I'm not going to spoil anything about this movie, but there's a turning point for one character that includes the utterance of the line, "It's not the body worries me, it's the ghost." And as soon as I heard that, I thought, that sounds like something from Macbeth. It isn't, but it does sound like it would fit in there, right? I'm thinking the banquet scene with Banquo's ghost. It's kind of an eerie line at a climactic moment, and it led me to consider other parallels, which I won't go into. There aren't very many anyway. It's kind of a loose comparison. I realize this makes me sound very nerdy, but it makes sense. It's a Scottish drama about the Highland Regiment. Macbeth is the Scottish play. The supporting cast includes Dennis Price, Gordon Jackson, Kay Walsh, John Fraser, and Susanna York, who gets an introducing credit, playing Alec Guinness's daughter. It's also a bit of a downer, but it's an interesting character-driven drama, complex and troubling, directed by Ronald Neame. Those are the movies I saw in April, minus one I already reviewed, and one that I guess I'm going to review, unless I change my mind again. A few of these movies that I saw on the Turner Classic Movies app, Watch TCM, are still up, so if you act fast, you can catch them. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've seen any of the movies that I discussed, feel free to leave your thoughts on them in the comments below. I look forward to reading them, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.